Okay. Before anybody comments on my sweatshirt, I know. I need to get it updated. I don't have the folklore Taylor on it. I know.
Dreaming of an open sky, the days where all the wrongs made right.
Islands by the Flower Kings. So, the Flower Kings are one of the star performers in terms of what I've deemed the retro prog outfit. These guys took what the 70s progressive rock was doing and rejuvenized it within the 90s. They were kind of one of the trailblazers in this. Like them and Spock's Beard were kind of like the two really big ones. Spock's Beard from the US, these guys from Sweden, kind of bringing forth this fun, optimistic expression of music, especially in the 90s when it was like really dominated by grunge and shoegaze and like very depressive, very heavy music. These guys were much more like a celebration of what the spirit of the past were. And so really got into these guys in their Unfold the Future album and then just like sunk into it. Like I was looking for those grand master epics of like the 20 to 30 minute long stretches of a single track. And so from there, I just fell in love with their discography to the point where I even did a worst to best, which I'm now kicking myself because I'm 2 albums out of date for it. Anyway, these guys have Roland Stolt being kind of the main orchestrator. He's the main guitarist, but he definitely does a lot of the vocal works along with, and I always mispronounce his name, Hassi or Hass Froberg. He also does most of the lyrics on this album as well as the acoustic guitar work. Now, one of my favorite additions to this band and one that I think really puts the Flower King's seal of approval is the bass player of Jonas Ringgold. I love Jonas's work in terms of that prominent, meaty bass work. Like we're looking at bass works from like Chris Squire-esque, that kind of thing. I love his personality that he brings to it. We have the same lineup that we had for Waiting for Miracles, the last album that they put out. They took like what, a 6 years hiatus, which was the longest stretch of time that they hadn't released music from Desolation Rose, the album they released in 2013, to Waiting for Miracles, the one that actually came out last year, which I wasn't a big fan of. I'm still on the record as Waiting for Miracles is one of their weaker albums. It doesn't have that same punch and that same personality. And I think part of that is maybe the two other individuals that came onto the album. I'm not saying that they're the worst additions. I'm just saying that they didn't jive with me. And that is the keyboardist of Zach Kamens. Zach does a good job, but he has to fill the shoes of Thomas Bodine. And Thomas is one of my favorite working keyboardists. Some of the things that he's able to do with creating a soundscape of music, I felt was lacking off of Waiting for Miracles. And same with the drummer of Mirko De Meo, I think that is. Again, I'm really bad. He replaced Felix Lehman, who was kind of working with the band previously. And so these same two are still with the band now. And I think this gave the leg up because Islands is definitely a step up from Waiting for Miracles. It still has its issues, though, and I want to talk about those, but I really want to talk about the strengths and some of the highlights of this. The band itself feels like they are much more of a cohesive whole on this album. I think all the boys are working much better and stronger together on this album. I really enjoy the playing styles that we have on this album. Islands is a perfect nomenclature. I think I just nomenclature and nomiker. I think I spliced this. Anyway, it's the perfect name for this album because it does feel like you're on a boat and you're visiting these smaller islands. And as a whole, for a grand total of like 92 minutes, it provides a very pleasant listen from start to finish. There's no point where anything is lagging. There's no point that I'm rushing to turn it off or skip the track. Everything on this album is very pleasant. Like I'm kind of reminded of their Flower Power to the Rainmaker, like those 3 albums with the Space Revolver being in the middle, and being very pleasant, very happy. Even on some of the somber tracks, like my favorite track of Morning News, it's still pleasant, it's still fun, it still has this very optimistic approach to it, which I really need now. And like I mentioned, like some of these tracks are really strong. Man in a Two-Piece Suite, or Man in a Two-Piece Suit, rather, is a brilliant outro on the electric guitar provided by Roland Stolt. Like, Roland can still play that guitar. He might not be shredding it like Satchman or John Petrucci, but he's able to emote so much with just a few notes that he's able to sustain. I do need to talk a little bit about some of the weaknesses of this album, though. The longest track is Solaris at 9 minutes and 10 seconds. And what I think this album would have really, really benefited from is a powerhouse epic. And this was something that was missing from Waiting for Miracles as well. Those like 14 to 30 minute massive epics would have landed themselves so perfectly on this album if they were there. And they're not. These are very short snippet tracks in comparison to what the Flower Kings usually produce. These 4 to 6 minute tracks, I feel like only have enough time to wet your whistle before they move on to something else. And this is especially true on the second disc, where so many of these tracks are instrumentals. I feel like if they had moved a couple of these instrumentals into the actual tracks themselves, like for example, the last 2 tracks off of the first disc, Heart of the Valley and Man in a Two-Piece Suit, I feel like if you had mushed these 2 tracks, these 4 and 3 minute tracks into an 8 minute track, it would have created a really well-rounded track. Like, I was really looking for a staple Flower Kings track. And I'm not saying that they can't produce an album that has these shorter snippets of music and produce something very special and produce something very good. Like, for example, on Paradox Hotel, the weakest track, or at least one of the weakest tracks, is the big 20-minute epic of Monsters and Men. Some of the smaller moments on those are my favorites, like Tiny Giant Step. I just wish I had more of those memorable moments on this one, because I don't really feel like those memorable moments are there. Outside of maybe Morning News, which I feel has this very personal affect about it. And I also kind of enjoy the rhythm and groove that we have on a couple of these. Like, the first track is All I Need Is Love, as well as the 8th track off of the first album of Tangerine. They do have that kind of infectious flow to it, and that is something that is found pretty prominently on this album as a whole. Like, another example of combining a couple of tracks, if we had combined some of the really brilliant music works that we have from second track of the second album, lots of stuff, the 13th track of A New Species. I love some of the playing styles on this, and I really got to shout out Zach for his piano work and his organs and synthesizers. His ability to noodle away on the keyboard work without it being just flying off in the sky into like the stratosphere, I loved. And especially when we have that really big build-up moment near the end point, where it's that dun 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 dun. Like, I feel myself getting really into it, and I wish it was in a larger suite of music that provided such a great build-up to a good crescendo and a good plateau. Instead, it's just in this almost 6 minute tracks that then goes into Northern Lights, which is still a fine track. And I love the groove, and I love the ebb and flow of the Northern Lights. It does remind me of like that classic Flower Kings that I was really hoping for Waiting for Miracles. And I wish that it was on something a little bit longer though. Because I'm loving Roland Stoltz's vocal works. I'm loving the atmosphere that we find on Northern Lights. I don't know. I wish that it was in something of a little bit of a longer stretch. Like, if they had smooshed, I say that a lot, if they had smooshed All I Need Is Love, A New Species, and Northern Lights into like a 15-minute track, or they blended these 3 tracks together in like a 1, 2, 3 punch, which I love those types of tracks, I think we could have had something really, really special. Instead, because they're these isolating little islands of tracks, and I feel like I'm on this boat surveying all these islands, I don't know. It's a different presentation. It's a really interesting experiment that I'm not quite sure worked as well as they had hoped. And I mean, if I'm talking about some of my favorite tracks, I really like Fool's Gold, and again, that very traditional Flower Kings esque. And this was something that I was kind of talking about. Jonas Ringgold being one of my favorite working bass players currently, I don't feel like his presence is felt on this album. At no point do I really feel like his essence is there. And it's not really until Fool's Gold, the third last track, that I'm really feeling his presence, that I'm feeling his personality on here. Like, That's one of the highlights from Fool's Gold, is that groove that Jonas is able to really hunker down and place down here. And the fact that I had to wait until the 19th track in order to really be like, oh yeah, Jonas is with the boys. I feel like that's a disservice to the talent that he is. And I don't know if it's just him kind of taking a step back, or I don't know. It was just interesting to have Fool's Gold be the only time where he came to the forefront. I do want to talk about the final two tracks of Between Hope and Fear and Islands, the title track. I love Islands, but I don't think it's a closer track. In fact, I think Between Hope and Fear is actually more of a closer track. It feels much more like a finality, like that big epic synth. It really unifies it at the end, and it provides a great punctual mark. And then they have the title track of Islands. I think Islands would have been better if it had opened the second album up rather than close the entire project down. Because when I listen to Islands, the title track, I feel like I'm wanting more, and not necessarily in a good light. Like it's a good way to get me hyped to hear more. So it's a great opening track rather than a closing track. So it's an interesting way. Now, I still love Between Hope and Fear. I love that big epicness. Again, I'm coming back to this time and time again. I wish that it had been in a bigger suite of music. Overall, though, like when all is said and done, overall, I do feel like Islands is a really strong album from the Flower Kings. Is it their best album? Not by a long shot. Is it their worst album? Not by a long shot. I feel like this is a better version of like the Rainmaker, or even like Space Revolver, which are good albums. But I feel like this has a little bit more of the maturity, a little bit more of the experience, and a little bit more of the fine tuning of those ideas that they had put down. I also feel like they're still trying new things. And unfortunately, I feel like some of those new things that they're trying don't really pan out in the long run. But this is still an album that I would have no problem downloading. Like, it's still that kind of a downloadable album. It's one that, even though it's like a 90-minute album, it still has enough here to never be boring. And I feel like if you sit down and listen to each album in isolation of one another, I feel like you're still getting a very well-rounded album on both tracks. Like, I like how CD1 is more constructed and thought out, and CD2 with a lot more instrumentals, like every other track practically is an instrumental. I feel like it's much more of a jam session. It's much more of, let's just see what works. And I don't know. I feel like if they had, it works fine for what it is, but I wonder if it would have worked better as one disc that trimmed off a little bit of the fat and combined some of these tracks into one or two 15 to 30 minute epics. I wonder if we would have had a better final product. But what we have here isn't bad. Like I said, it's getting the download rating, so it's not a bad album. I just think it has some room to grow. So yeah, that's what I've got for the Flower Kings album of Islands. What did you guys think? Did you love this album? Did you hate this album? What did you think? Let me know about your thoughts by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I have a podcast if you haven't already checked it out. Quid Prog Quo. Check it out wherever podcasts can be found. If you like what you see, consider donating. I've got my Patreon and PayPal information down below. You can check that out as well. And I think that's all I got. That's all I got. So thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are obviously and definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.
And you heard it on the news.